He sets the glass down without looking at it, not because he's distracted, because he knows exactly where the side table is. He's been putting things on that table for 11 years, and his hand finds the spot the same way it finds the light switch in a dark hallway without thought, without error. The glass is maker's mark. 2 fingers, no ice. It's 11:17 p.m. on a Tuesday in a house in Akron, Ohio. Or maybe Swindon. Or maybe the end of a quiet street in Calgary where the snow is already gone, but the cold hasn't gotten the message yet. His name is Dave. Or it isn't. That part doesn't matter. What matters is this. The TV is off. Not paused. Off. The room smells like wood, and something faintly mechanical, machine oil maybe, or the residual ghost of a project that got finished last weekend. There's a Leatherman on the side table that he meant to put away 3 days ago. He's looked at it twice. He'll put it away when he puts it away. He's not scrolling. He's not filling the silence with a podcast about someone else's problems. He is sitting in a leather chair that has taken the shape of him over years of exactly this, and he is doing what people who do not understand him would call nothing. He would not call it nothing. He would not call it anything, actually, because the whole point is that it doesn't need a name. This is not a video about what's wrong with that man. Nothing is wrong with that man. This is a video about what happened to him specifically, precisely, in a sequence that goes further back than most people would think to look, and why the way he lives now is not the result of damage or withdrawal or whatever the current terminology is for a man who has stopped performing contentment. For an audience, there is no audience. That's the whole point. Somewhere around 53, something gets decided. Not announced, not journaled about, just settled. The social math stops running in the background. The background hum of, should I be somewhere else right now? Should I be doing something else? Should I have more people in my life? Goes quiet. And what's left, once that hum is gone, is a room that smells like wood and machine oil at 11:17 p.m. and a man who put his glass down without looking because he already knows where everything is. That's not emptiness. That's a very specific kind of fullness. And it took most of his life to get here. Here's what the mainstream narrative would tell you about that man. That he's lonely. That his stillness is avoidance, wearing the mask of contentment. That men who live alone, who prefer their own company, who have quietly reduced their social footprint to a handful of people and a well-maintained daily routine, that these men are a public health problem. A cautionary tale in a recliner. You've heard this framing. It shows up in think pieces. In television, documentaries narrated with quiet concern. In conversations with people who have decided that a man sitting alone in a well-organized house is a symptom rather than a choice. The problem with that framing is that it deliberately blurs a distinction that the research absolutely does not blur. Dr. Julianne Holt-Lundstad at Brigham Young University spent years compiling what became one of the most cited analyses in social health research, a 2015 meta-analysis published in Perspectives on Psychological Science, drawing on 148 studies and data from over 300,000 people. The finding that made headlines was stark. Social isolation is as damaging to health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That got repeated everywhere. What got left out of almost every headline is the part that matters most for this conversation. The health risk Holt-Lundstad identified is most strongly associated with unwanted isolation, with loneliness, specifically not solitude. Those are not the same word. They are not even close to the same experience. A man who wants to be alone, and is alone, is in a categorically different psychological position than a man who wants connection and cannot find it. Dave is in the first category, and the research knows the difference, even if the headlines don't. The misreading didn't start with bad intentions. It started with bad frameworks. For most of the 20th century, the dominant psychological model of healthy adult development assumed that connection frequent, emotionally expressive, face-to-face connection was the baseline. Anything that deviated from that baseline was a problem to be solved. The framework was built in academic environments, primarily on populations that were studied because they were available. College students, clinical patients, and people who had specifically sought help. Men who were quietly fine and wanted nothing from psychology were not in those rooms, so they didn't make it into the models. Then came 2019. The American Psychological Association published its Guidelines for Psychological Practice with Men and Boys, a document that had been in development for a decade and arrived with considerable institutional weight. The guidelines described what they called traditional masculinity ideology, stoicism, self-reliance, competitiveness, as, in their framing, on the whole, harmful. Not neutral, not contextual, harmful. Dr. Ryan McDermott at the University of South Alabama was among the researchers who pushed back, pointing out that the guidelines conflated a specific cluster of toxic behaviors with an entire orientation toward emotional management that, for many men, is functional, stable, and genuinely preferred. Stoicism is not the same as suppression. Self-reliance is not the same as isolation. Competence-based identity is not a wound dressed up as a personality. The cultural machinery had decided what the healthy man looked like. He talked about his feelings. He maintained a wide social network. He processed emotions verbally and regularly. He was essentially a particular model of person, and men who didn't fit that model were quietly filed under needs work. Gen X men, specifically, did not ask to be filed anywhere. They were already done filing things themselves. The wrong verdict wasn't malicious. It was a category error. And category errors, if they go unchallenged long enough, start to look like facts. Go back to 1979 or 1981. Pick a year, any year from that decade, and find a 9-year-old boy walking home from school. It's 3:30 inches the afternoon. The street is ordinary, a suburb of somewhere unremarkable. The kind of block where every house looks like a considered compromise. He turns the key before he gets to the door. He knows which pocket it's in. He's known since the first day his mother put it on the string around his neck and explained briefly what it was for. Not what to do if something went wrong. Just what it was for. The rest, he would figure out. He opens the door into a house that is empty in a specific way, not abandoned, not neglected, just temporarily unoccupied. It smells like the morning. Breakfast dishes possibly still in the sink. He drops his bag, goes to the refrigerator, makes a decision about food without anyone asking him what he wants. Then he figures out what to do with the next 2 to 3 hours. No one tells him. No one is there to tell him. Dr. Lynette Long and Dr. Thomas Long first formally documented this population in a 1983 study funded by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. Their initial estimate of 2 million latchkey children in the United States was revised to over 7 million by 1984. 7 million children, routinely managing empty houses, unsupervised afternoons, and operational independence at ages when the psychological literature expected dependency. What happened in those houses was not trauma in the clinical sense of a discrete event. It was something more like slow installation. The boy learned to manage his own time. He learned to solve small problems, a leaky faucet, a locked door, a broken appliance before asking anyone for help. He learned that the interior of a house, when it belongs to you alone for several hours, is not frightening. It is manageable. It is, in fact, preferable to certain kinds of company. That preference did not go away when he grew up. It deepened. It refined itself. It became a template for how adult space should feel under control. The 5-3-year-old man in the leather chair in Akron is not avoiding the world. He is replicating the most functional environment he ever knew, with better furniture and maker's mark instead of whatever was in the back of the fridge. The blueprint was drawn before he was 10. He's been building to it ever since. The behavioral profile that looks unusual from the outside has been documented across multiple independent lines of research as something considerably more coherent than the mainstream narrative suggests. Start with what the man actually does when he's alone. Dr. Stuart Brown, psychiatrist, founder of the National Institute for Play, and author of Play, How It Shapes the Brain, 2009, spent decades mapping what he called play personalities in adults. What he found, across his research with thousands of subjects, is that a significant portion of men gravitate toward what he termed the explorer and the craftsman play personalities, defined by solitary skill development, physical problem solving, and the particular satisfaction of making something work. Men who spend evenings on woodworking projects, who take engines apart and put them back together, who fish alone at 5 am in 30-degree weather, these men are not, in neurological terms, disengaged from life. They are in states of high cognitive function and positive affect. They are, in measurable terms, doing very well. Then consider the perceptual sensitivity question. Dr. Elaine Aron at Stony Brook University developed the concept of high sensory processing sensitivity in the mid-1990s, documented in her 1996 book, The Highly Sensitive Person, and in subsequent peer-reviewed research. Her data consistently finds that approximately 15 to 20% of the population processes sensory and emotional stimuli more deeply and thoroughly than average. Among men who meet this profile, the preference for lower stimulation environments is not avoidance, it is optimization. Too much input degrades their performance. Quiet is not absence, it's the condition under which they function best. These men are routinely misread as antisocial. The data says they are simply calibrated differently. And then there is the study that most directly addresses what Dave is doing in his chair at 11:17 p.m. In 2021, Social, Psychological, and Personality Science published research by Thuy-V Nguyen, Richard Ryan, and Edward Deci at the University of Rochester researchers, whose work sits at the foundation of self-determination theory, one of the most empirically supported frameworks in motivational psychology. Their study specifically examined the distinction between autonomous solitude, solitude that is chosen, and imposed isolation. The finding was unambiguous. Men who chose to be alone reported significantly higher positive affect and significantly lower anxiety than men who maintained frequent, low-quality social contact. Read that again. Chosen solitude, in this study, outperformed unwanted socializing on every subjective well-being measure tested. Dave would not be surprised by this. He didn't need a study. But it's useful sometimes to have the data confirm what you already knew in your bones. There's a state that this man inhabits, that Dave inhabits, that you may recognize in yourself that has no satisfactory name in common use. It's not introversion, though introversion is part of it. It's not contentment, which has a slightly soft and passive quality that doesn't fit. It's not independence, which is about relation to others. It's not solitude, which is simply descriptive. None of these words capture the specific quality of a man who has so thoroughly internalized authority over his own time, his own space, and his own internal weather that silence is not an absence to be filled. It is a presence, occupied territory. Call it sovereign stillness. Sovereign stillness is not a mood. It's not a coping mechanism. It is an achieved state built over decades of self-organization, tested against circumstances that occasionally required a great deal from a man who had learned not to outsource his own equilibrium. It is the state in which the man knows exactly where the Leatherman is. He knows what's in his refrigerator, what the car needs next, which drawer has the right bit for the job. The house is not chaotic. The routine is not rigid, it's efficient. Everything has a place, because everything having a place is what allows him to spend his mental energy on things that actually interest him. This is the interior architecture of sovereign stillness. The external order is not aesthetics. It is infrastructure. Men in sovereign stillness are often described by people who don't understand them as set in their ways. This phrasing is almost perfectly backwards. A man in sovereign stillness has reduced unnecessary friction to the point where his days run cleanly enough that deviation, when it comes a friend who needs help, a project that demands full attention, a situation that requires everything he has doesn't cost him the kind of energy it costs someone who never organized their baseline. The stillness is what makes the other things possible. It took most of his adult life to build this. Most people mistake the building for the problem. Here is something that doesn't appear in the mainstream account of this man. He is not, in any meaningful sense, cold. He drove 4 hours on a Saturday without being asked twice to help a friend move a truck full of furniture to a new apartment in a city he doesn't like. He said nothing significant on the drive. He worked for 6 hours. He found a better way to get the sectional around the third-floor landing than the friend had planned. He drove home. He did not mention it again. That was love, expressed in the only language that felt real. Dr. Daniel Griffith and colleagues, studying male friendship patterns at the University of Maryland, documented what most men in this demographic already know from experience. Men's most functional intimacy is activity-mediated. It happens side by side, not face to face. The connection is real. The mechanism is just different. You work on the engine together, or you don't work on it at all. And somehow, 3 hours with tools in your hands tells you more about who the other person is than any conversation could. Dave has a friend he texts once every 2 months, sometimes less. When they do talk, they don't catch up. They pick up. There is no preamble. The friendship has no maintenance schedule because it doesn't need one. It's load-bearing, not decorative. He also has a brother he hasn't spoken to in 4 months who knows, with complete certainty, that Dave would be at his door within a day if something went wrong. This is not emotional distance. This is a different geometry of care, one that is efficient, dependable, and entirely unmoved by the requirement to perform closeness for an audience that isn't there. The man in the chair is not alone because he cannot connect. He connects the way he does everything else, on his terms, at the level required, and not a single unit beyond that. Let's be precise about what happened here. A set of behaviors that developed in response to a specific environmental pressure autonomy imposed early, self-regulation trained before it was asked for, solitude normalized. Before it could be feared was looked at by institutional psychology and labeled as deficit, as damage, as the kind of thing that needed to be addressed before it calcified further. What the data actually shows is something else entirely. Men who operate in low stimulation, self-directed environments demonstrate measurably lower cortisol reactivity. This is not a metaphor. Cortisol is the body's primary stress hormone, and chronic elevation of it is associated with nearly every major health outcome that shortens life expectancy. Research on introversion and autonomic stress response, including work published in Psychophysiology and reviewed extensively in Susan Cain's Quiet, 2012, which drew on neuroscientist Elaine Aron's foundational research, consistently finds that men who prefer and inhabit quieter, lower input environments maintain physiological baselines that are, objectively, healthier than those maintained by men in chronic high-stimulation social environments. Task completion and depth of focus also favor this profile. The cognitive state that Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi at the University of Chicago spent decades documenting, what he called flow, the state of complete absorption in a challenging task, is significantly more accessible in low-distraction, self-organized environments. The man, working alone in his garage on a Saturday, in complete silence, running a problem until it's solved, is not retreating from life. He is, in Csikszentmihalyi's terms, living it at its highest available resolution. And then there's the one that should be stated plainly, without editorializing. The behaviors that are described as avoidant or emotionally unavailable in a man are, in current cultural language, described as setting boundaries and protecting one's energy when observed in other contexts. The content is essentially identical. The label applied depends entirely on who is doing the labeling and whom they have decided to grant the presumption of intentionality. Gen X men never got that presumption. Their self-containment was read as damage. Their silence was read as shutdown. Their preference for managed selective engagement was read as failure to connect. The data suggests a different reading. The data suggests that what was trained into these men before anyone asked if it was appropriate turned out, in a significant number of measurable ways, to be exactly the right preparation for the life they ended up living. They didn't know that at 9 years old with a key around their neck, but they built toward it anyway. It's 11:43 p.m. now. Dave hasn't moved much. The glass is the same level, maybe he refilled it, maybe not. The Leatherman is still on the side table. He'll put it away tomorrow, or he won't. And either way, the house will remain exactly as organized as it needs to be for him to find everything he requires without looking. Here's the line that runs from then to now. A 9-year-old boy came home to a house that was empty and learned not because anyone taught him, but because the situation required it. That empty was manageable, that silence was workable, that the most reliable person in a given situation was the person already in the room. He learned to organize his own space, regulate his own time, and find something genuinely close to peace in an interior life that no one else had access to. He is 53 now. The house is different. The silence is chosen. The key is on a hook by the door, not around his neck, But the relationship to it, the fact that he knows exactly where it is and has never once panicked about finding it, is the same relationship it has always been. The child had to learn to be fine alone before anyone thought to ask if he was. The man already is. If something in this mapped onto a man you know, or onto a version of yourself you recognize from a few decades back, there's a next video that follows from this one directly. It's about what happens when Gen X men who spent a lifetime mastering self-sufficiency are suddenly faced with aging parents who need the kind of help nobody trained them to ask for or provide. Different problem, same psychology underneath. It's in the queue. If you want to leave something in the comments, the section beneath this video tends to be against all reasonable expectations for the internet, worth reading occasionally. Not for validation, just because it turns out a specific kind of interior life, built under specific conditions, runs almost identically in men across completely different cities and countries and decades. There's something mildly interesting about that. Whether you find it interesting enough to mention is entirely up to you. The like button is there if the algorithm matters to you. No particular pressure from this end.